I'm Willa Gerson, and the morning I discovered my family was selling my inheritance out from under me, they were simultaneously joking about sending me to a cheap diner so I wouldn't interrupt their closing. I sat at my monitors watching them plan a fake Thanksgiving behind my back, unaware that I was archiving every text. I want you to keep their smug certainty in mind, because 4 days later, I would stand on the porch of that very cabin holding a single document that would legally dismantle their plans. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where quiet boundaries break loud betrayals. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, you are in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me how old you are right now, and be sure to subscribe. This story starts with a slipped thumb, and it ends with $1 million deal turning to dust. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning. I work as an information security analyst. My career is built on finding the exact moment a secure system gets breached. For my family, that breach happened at 9:14 in the morning. My sister Harper has always been careless with technology. In her rush to coordinate a secret holiday gathering, her thumb slipped. She added my secondary work number, a phone I use strictly for authentication audits, to a group chat titled Operation Turkey Drop. I sat at my desk and watched the messages load. There were 3 people in the chat: my mother Susan, my older brother, Mason, and Harper. My mother wrote to make sure I didn't find out, claiming she didn't have the energy to manage my moods. Mason replied that they should just give me the wrong address like last time. 2 years ago, they had actually done that. I sat alone in a booth for 3 hours on Thanksgiving waiting for a family that never showed up. Reading Mason's text brought the taste of that cold diner coffee right back to my throat. But the exclusion was only a diversion. The true threat landed 3 messages later. Harper uploaded an attachment named Final Purchase Agreement. I opened it. It was a commercial real estate contract for our family cabin on Moosehead Lake. The buyer was a Boston developer paying over $1 million in cash. They were using the holiday weekend to conduct a private walkthrough and sign the closing papers while I was out of the way. I didn't call my mother. I didn't throw my phone. You never warn a hostile actor that you have identified their intrusion. You monitor their movements. I took screenshots of every message. I downloaded the forged contract to a secure drive. They had the logistics planned down to the hour. They had a wealthy buyer, but they had neglected to verify one crucial detail about the name on the actual deed, to understand the weight of a forged real estate contract. In this state, you have to understand the geography of our family history. Up in the northern woods of Maine, a lakeside cabin is never just real estate. Locals call it a camp. The word carries a specific gravity. A camp represents generations of rustic self-reliance. It means wood smoke clinging to your wool sweaters, chopping your own firewood before the first freeze, and maintaining strict, unyielding boundaries regarding land ownership. You do not touch another person's timber, and you certainly do not sell their shoreline. My grandfather Silas built our camp on Moosehead Lake in the summer of 1978. He poured the foundation himself, framed the walls with local pine, and hammered every nail on the wraparound porch. Silas was a stoic man. He spoke in short sentences and valued hard work over loud opinions. He also possessed a terrifying ability to see right through people. He watched my mother Susan parade around the local country club, obsessed with curating an image of wealth we did not possess. He watched my brother Mason demand investments for businesses that never materialized. He watched my sister Harper treat every room she entered like a personal dressing room, leaving chaos in her wake. Silas saw their reckless entitlement, and he despised it. I was the anomaly in the family tree. While Mason complained about the lack of cellular service and Harper whined about the mosquitoes, I followed Silas around the property with a toolbox. By the time I was 12, I knew how to bleed the air out of the water pump. At 16, I could replace a cracked roof shingle in the rain. Silas and I understood each other. We preferred the quiet rhythm of maintenance over the exhaust fumes of family drama. When I became an information security analyst, Silas told me the career made perfect sense. I spent my life looking for cracks in the foundation and patching them before the structure failed. 3 years ago, Silas got sick. It happened fast. A quiet, sudden decline kept him confined to a hospital bed in Bangor. My family immediately began circling like vultures. Susan started measuring the cabin for modern renovations she planned to fund by taking out a second mortgage on the property. Mason brought a real estate agent to the hospital cafeteria to discuss subdividing the lakefront acres. They assumed the camp would pass directly to Susan as the only child, or be split among the grandchildren in a messy probate battle. They began spending the equity in their heads before Silas even took his last breath. They underestimated my grandfather. Silas valued discretion, and my entire profession revolves around operational security. 2 months before he passed, Silas asked me to bring a notary and a trust attorney to his hospital room. We bypassed my mother entirely. Silas legally transferred the Moosehead Lake deed into a quiet, irrevocable trust, naming me as the sole beneficiary and trustee. He looked at me from his hospital bed, his breathing shallow but his eyes sharp, and told me to protect the timber. He knew Susan would sell it to the highest bidder the moment he was gone. He trusted me to hold the line. When Silas died, my family assumed the camp was tied up in a complicated probate process. I let them believe it. I never corrected Susan when she loudly complained about the slow court system during Thanksgiving dinners. I kept the trust documents locked in a fireproof safe. For 3 years, I acted as the silent guardian of the property. Those 3 years were a masterclass in silent endurance. Maine property taxes on lakefront acreage are steep. The winterization costs the roof repairs. The septic maintenance all require significant capital. I paid every single bill out of my own pocket using my salary to keep my grandfather's legacy intact. I drove a 10-year-old sedan and skipped vacations to ensure the county taxes were paid in full every November. Meanwhile, my family treated the camp as their personal free vacation rental. Just last summer, Harper hosted a lavish 4th of July party for 20 of her friends. She did not ask my permission. She simply demanded the entry code from our mother, who gladly handed it over. They left the porch littered with empty hard seltzer cans, tracked mud across the vintage pine floors, and nearly burned out the water pump by leaving a hose running overnight. I drove 2 hours up the coast on a Sunday morning to clean up the wreckage. I scrubbed the floors on my hands and knees. I bagged their trash. I replaced the burnt fuses. Susan called me while I was wiping down the kitchen counters, praising herself for letting me use the camp for a quiet weekend. She told me to make sure the windows were locked, assuming I was just the reliable quiet sister who existed to manage their messes. They thought I was a maid. They had no idea that every time they stepped onto that pine-planked porch, they were standing on my legally owned land. Every party they threw, every summer weekend they claimed occurred solely because I allowed it. I kept the secret because I preferred the peace of their ignorance over the chaos of their greed. I let them play house on my property because confronting them would have sparked a relentless campaign of emotional extortion. I accepted the burden of being the invisible landlord because it protected the land Silas loved. I watched my brother post photos of the lake on social media claiming the rugged lifestyle as his own, while I was the one who crawled under the foundation to insulate the pipes in December. I watched my mother host her bridge club on the deck, playing the role of the generous matriarch, while my bank account drained to keep the property from falling into disrepair. I traded my recognition for the cabin's safety. It was a heavy trade, but it was one I made willingly. Every time I ran my hand along the rough timber of the porch railing, I felt my grandfather's presence. The deed in my safe was not just a legal document. It was a promise I had made to a dying man. I was holding the line just as he asked. But looking at the PDF on my computer screen, the dynamic fractured permanently. The arrangement of silent tolerance was over. My mother and my siblings were not just taking advantage of a free vacation spot anymore. They had crossed a legal threshold. To sell a property they did not own, they needed documentation. They needed a signature. And since Silas had removed his name from the deed 3 years ago, whatever paperwork they were presenting to that Boston developer was a fabrication. A commercial real estate transaction requires layers of verification. It requires title searches, notarized signatures, and municipal filings. If Mason and Susan had convinced a buyer to wire over $1 million, they had left a digital trail of fraud wide enough to drive a truck through. I closed the group chat window and opened my forensic toolkit. It was time to pull the metadata and find exactly whose signature they had forged to steal my land. When you transition from a sister to a cybersecurity analyst, the emotional center of your brain shuts down and the analytical engine takes over. I stopped looking at the group chat as a family conversation. I began treating my family exactly like a compromised network. In my profession, when an unauthorized user accesses a protected system, you do not panic. You isolate the breach, analyze the entry point, and trace the digital footprints back to their source. I dragged the commercial real estate contract Harper had uploaded into an isolated sandbox environment on my workstation. A sandbox prevents embedded code from executing on a host machine, but it also allows an analyst to dissect a file down to its foundational framework. I ran a standard extraction tool to pull the metadata. Most people believe that when they save a document, they are only saving the text on the page. They do not realize the software automatically logs a silent, invisible history of every person who touched the file when they created it and what specific machine they used. The digital footprint left on the purchase agreement was careless. The author tag on the document properties read Mason MacBook Pro. Mason fancies himself a real estate mogul. He spent his 20s jumping from one disastrous venture to the next, fueled by our mother's endless financial bailouts and his own unearned confidence. He tried to open an artisanal brewery that folded within 6 months because he forgot to secure the proper zoning permits. After that, he started a house-flipping business that went bankrupt when he attempted to manage a gut renovation without hiring licensed contractors. Mason habitually seeks the shortcut, believing he can outsmart the systems he tries to manipulate. That arrogance translated perfectly to his digital habits. I scrolled past the standard commercial real estate boilerplate language and found the supplementary documents attached to the end of the PDF. There, sitting on page 14, was a drafted quitclaim deed. This is the legal instrument used to transfer property rights. At the bottom of the page was my grandfather Silas's signature. I leaned closer to the monitor. I knew Silas's handwriting the way I knew my own face. He pressed hard on the paper, leaving thick, deliberate ink strokes, especially on the loop of his S. The signature on the screen looked correct at first glance. But when I magnified the document by 400%, the truth appeared in the pixels. The edges of the signature were jagged, bearing the distinct digital artifacting of a low-resolution image file. I opened a split screen and pulled up the digitized copies of Silas's old financial records I kept on a secure server. I overlaid the signature from the quitclaim deed onto a 2017 federal tax return. It was a pixel-for-pixel match. No human signs their name exactly the same way twice. Mason had taken a photograph of an old tax document, used cheap software to isolate the signature, and pasted it onto the fraudulent deed. His fatal error was born from his characteristic cheapness. Before attempting to sell a piece of real estate, any competent professional pulls the current title from the county clerk to verify ownership. That public record search costs about $40. Mason, certain of his own assumptions and eager to save a tiny expense, had skipped that step. He forged my grandfather's signature onto a document, entirely unaware that Silas's name had been legally removed from the property records 3 years prior. Mason had just committed forgery to transfer a property from a man who no longer owned it. But Mason was only the technician. The architect of the fraud was Susan. I kept digging into the PDF. Mason had exported the document from a cloud-based text editor, but he had failed to flatten the file properly. By running a basic script, I recovered the revision history and a hyperlink embedded in a deleted comment block. The link pointed to an unsecured cloud storage directory. Mason had left the front door wide open. I clicked the link. It dropped me directly into a shared folder containing an email chain exported as a text file. The correspondence was between my mother and a high-end real estate broker located in Boston. I sat in the quiet glow of my office and read the negotiation. Susan used her signature corporate tune blending manufactured charm with ruthless urgency. She told the broker the family was looking to liquidate a historic asset quietly to settle an estate. The broker, eager to secure prime lakefront acreage for a wealthy developer, did not ask probing questions. They negotiated an all-cash deal. $1.2 million. The plan laid out in those emails was brilliantly calculated. Susan orchestrated the Thanksgiving weekend timeline to perfection. She knew the county offices would be closed for the holiday, preventing any last-minute public record checks. She planned to host a fake Thanksgiving dinner at the camp, using the holiday as a cover for the wealthy buyers to conduct their final walkthrough. They would sign the forged papers on the very porch Silas built, and the Boston firm would wire the funds the following Monday morning. I found the wire transfer instructions, saved in a separate text file. The routing number did not direct the funds to an estate account. It pointed to a newly created joint checking account, controlled exclusively by Susan and Harper. They planned to bypass probate, drain the cash the moment it cleared, and disappear the money into various personal accounts before anyone could trace it. Then I found the script. It was a bulleted list titled Talking Points, drafted by Susan, outlining exactly how they were going to handle me. I read the words on the screen, and the cold logic of my profession briefly gave way to a sharp physical ache in my chest. Susan had written out a narrative to feed me after the sale was complete. She planned to call me in early December, pretending to be devastated. She was going to tell me Silas had left a mountain of hidden debt, that the county had placed a lien on the Moosehead camp for years of unpaid back taxes, and that the state had seized the property. She was going to let me believe I had failed to protect the one thing my grandfather asked me to guard. She planned to watch me mourn the loss of the cabin, knowing all along the money from its sale was sitting in her bank account. She knew I paid the taxes out of my own pocket every year, yet she was prepared to look me in the eye and lie about a county seizure just to cover her theft. I exported the entire directory. I downloaded every email, every forged signature, and every drafted lie. I built an airtight chain of custody for the digital evidence, sealing it in a secure encrypted container. Every document they generated in that shared folder constituted a separate felony. There was wire fraud conspiracy, forgery of a legal instrument, and intent to defraud. A normal person might have picked up the phone right then, called their mother, and demanded an explanation. A normal person might have screamed, threatened to call the police, or sent an angry text to the group chat demanding they stop. I did none of those things. In information security, you learn a vital lesson early in your career. You do not warn a virus that you are building a firewall. If you alert a malicious program that it has been detected, it will mutate. It will delete its tracks, overwrite its core files, and burrow deeper into the system where you cannot reach it. If I confronted Susan and Mason now, they would delete the cloud directory, burn the fake deed, and invent a story about a misunderstanding. They would retreat, regroup, and find a quieter way to ruin me. Instead, you let the virus execute in a controlled environment. You allow it to run its sequence, open its ports, and transfer its payload, while you silently log every single action it takes. You let it trap itself. I closed my laptop and locked the screen. The holiday was 3 days away. They needed me out of the picture to execute their final walkthrough. I knew the decoy invitation was coming. I just had to wait for Susan to cast the line. The psychological manipulation escalated on Thursday evening. In my line of work, the waiting is always the most exhausting phase of an active breach. You know the threat actor is inside the network. You know they are gathering assets. You just have to sit in the dark and wait for them to initiate the final sequence. I spent Thursday pacing my apartment in Portland, watching the rain streak the glass of my living room window, waiting for my mother to make her move. I knew she had to contact me. To execute a real estate closing on a holiday weekend, they needed unquestionable certainty that I would not drive up to Moosehead Lake. They needed to place me in a geographical box, lock the lid, and throw away the key until the wire transfer cleared. At exactly 6 o'clock, my phone illuminated on the kitchen counter. The caller ID displayed Susan's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing before sliding my finger across the glass. I answered with a distracted, tired greeting, perfectly mimicking a woman who had spent the last 10 hours buried in security audits. My mother responded, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. This specific tone was a staple of my childhood. Susan never offered affection freely. Her warmth was a tactical deployment utilized only when she needed to secure compliance or obscure a deception. Growing up, whenever she used the word sweetie, It meant I was about to be asked to clean up a mess Mason had made or quietly sacrifice a weekend to help Harper out of a self-inflicted crisis. "Willa, sweetie," her voice purred through the speaker. She sounded relaxed, projecting the casual, breezy attitude of a woman without a single felony on her conscience. "We are keeping Thanksgiving very low-key this year. We decided not to do the whole big cabin production. Mason is just going to host a small get-together at his apartment in Portland. We would love for you to come, but we know how incredibly busy your tech job keeps you right now." She paused, letting this false sympathy breathe. It was a beautiful, calculated trap. She framed the invitation as an afterthought, giving me an easy out to decline due to work. But then she dropped the anchor. "If you can take a few hours away from your screens, we are all going to meet up around 4 o'clock. She continued reading off a street address on the edge of town. I recognized the street number instantly. It was not Mason's apartment. It was the address of a rundown strip mall diner just off the interstate. It was the exact same diner Mason had joked about in the secret group chat. This was the pebble of emotional warfare that hurt far worse than the financial fraud. They were not just stealing my grandfather's legacy. They were actively scripting my humiliation. They intended to send me to a booth in a neon-lit diner on Thanksgiving Day, expecting me to sit there alone, checking my watch, drinking stale coffee, and waiting for a family that was currently standing on my property, signing away my inheritance. It was a loyalty test disguised as a holiday invitation. They wanted to see if I suspected anything. If I argued or if I suggested driving to the lake instead, they would know their operation was compromised. I kept my vocal cords loose and my breathing even. I employed the foundational principle of zero-trust architecture. In a zero-trust environment, you never authenticate an anomalous request, but you also never alert the host that they have failed the verification check. You simply feed them the expected response and continue logging their activity. I played the naive, overworked scapegoat they desperately needed me to be. "That sounds perfect, Mom," I said, injecting just enough exhaustion into my tone to sell the lie. "I have an extensive code review dropping on Wednesday night, so staying in Portland is actually a huge relief. I can definitely meet you all at Mason's place at 4. I will bring a pie." "Oh, that is wonderful, Willa," she replied, and I could hear the sheer profound relief washing over her words. "We will see you Thursday. Do not work too hard." The line went dead. By accepting the decoy invitation, I had given them the false confidence required to proceed with the camp sale. I had handed them the final piece of their logistical puzzle. As soon as I set the phone down on the granite counter, the silence of my apartment pressed inward. I felt the cold, hard reality of my isolation settle into my bones. Financial crimes are sterile. They happen on paper and in routing numbers. But the betrayal of a mother sending her daughter to sit alone in a diner on a holiday of gratitude is a deeply intimate kind of harm. I stood in my kitchen and let the weight of it sink in. For years, I had justified their distance. I told myself that Mason required more attention because he was careless. I told myself Harper needed more financial support because she was fragile. I assumed my mother relied on me to be the stable foundation of the family. I had rationalized my own neglect, believing that my independence was a form of silent love. But the phone call stripped away the remaining illusions. They did not view my independence as a virtue. They viewed it as a vulnerability they could exploit. They were willing to discard me to let me eat a solitary meal surrounded by strangers on a holiday, just so they could steal the land my grandfather had entrusted to my care. The grief lasted exactly 5 minutes. Then the analytical engine engaged once again. The time for passive monitoring had expired. The threat actors were moving into the execution phase, and I needed to prepare my countermeasures. I walked into my bedroom and pulled open the bottom drawer of my closet. I reached past the winter sweaters and retrieved my grandfather Silas's old work bag. It was a heavy, weathered leather satchel, scarred from years of being tossed into the bed of his pickup truck. The leather smelled faintly of pine sap engine oil and the sharp, clean air of Moosehead Lake. Silas had carried his property deeds and his thermos in this bag when he built the camp. It felt entirely appropriate that I would carry the instruments of its salvation in the exact same vessel. I carried the bag to my desk. I unzipped the main compartment and began to pack. I slid my primary laptop into the padded sleeve, ensuring it held the encrypted drive containing the forged purchase agreement, the chat logs, and the metadata connecting Mason to the fraudulent quitclaim deed. I printed physical copies of every piece of digital evidence, placing the thick stack of papers into a manila envelope. Digital files can be disputed or ignored by people who do not understand technology. A physical stack of forged documents placed on a wooden table carries an undeniable physical weight. Finally, I opened my fireproof safe and extracted the most critical asset in my possession: the authentic county-stamped irrevocable trust deed, transferring the Moosehead Lake property to Willa Gerson. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and unyielding. I placed the authentic deed into a separate red folder, sliding it into the leather bag right next to the forged counterpart. I zipped the heavy leather bag shut. The decoy dinner was scheduled for next Thursday, but the commercial appraisal for the buyer was imminent. A cash buyer pouring over $1 million into a rural property would demand a structural assessment before closing. The family thought they had placed me in a neat little box in Portland. They had no idea I was about to drive north to intercept their appraiser. On Monday morning, 3 days before Thanksgiving. The frost coating my Portland apartment windows was thick enough to carve with a key. I sat in my home office running a diagnostic sequence on a remote client server when a sharp chime broke the silence of the room. It was a push notification from my encrypted surveillance application. I installed the security cameras 2 winters ago. They are high-definition weather-sealed lenses tucked discreetly beneath the deep pine eaves of the Moosehead Lake cabin. My original purpose for the equipment was purely logistical. Snow loads in northern Maine can warp a roof or crack supporting joists if left unchecked. I needed to monitor the accumulation to know exactly when to drive up and clear the shingles. My grandfather Silas had always done it by eye feeling the barometer drop and predicting the snowfall. I relied on optical sensors and gigabit connections. We both protected the structure in our own distinct ways. The notification indicated a motion trigger in Zone 2, which covers the front perimeter and the gravel driveway. I pulled the live video feed onto my primary monitor. A man was walking across the frozen yard. He wore a tailored wool overcoat, polished dress shoes, and carried a thick leather clipboard. Nobody wears dress shoes to a remote cabin in late November, unless they are entirely unfamiliar with the terrain. He stopped at the edge of the wraparound porch, stomped his feet to test the wooden planks, and began writing notes. How was an appraiser? The Boston Holding Company was conducting their due diligence. I did not call local law enforcement to report a trespasser. Involving the police would trigger a superficial misdemeanor investigation. A squad car pulling up to the property would spook my family, scatter the evidence, and tip them off before their actions crystallized into a federal offense. I needed this man to finish his job. I just needed to supervise the process. I grabbed my keys, filled a thermos with black coffee, and walked out the door. The drive from Portland to Moosehead Lake takes roughly 2 hours if you know how to navigate the logging routes. The landscape transforms as you head north. The coastal infrastructure fades, replaced by dense stands of birch and towering evergreen trees. The air grows noticeably thinner and colder. This was the exact route Silas used to drive every Friday afternoon, escaping the noise of the city to find solace in the silence of the woods. He built the cabin as a sanctuary, a quiet place where the superficial concerns of my mother and siblings could not penetrate the thick timber walls. Now they were trying to put a price tag on his sanctuary. I turned onto the final dirt access road, my tires crunching over the frozen ruts. Through the cabin sat sturdy and defiant against the gray November sky. The appraiser was still there. He was currently inspecting the fieldstone chimney. Silas had hauled up from the riverbed by hand. I parked my sedan a short distance away, letting the loud crunch of the gravel announce my arrival. The man turned quickly, looking startled, clutching his clipboard against his chest. I stepped out of the car, projecting the calm, non-threatening demeanor of an employee just doing her job. I introduced myself simply as Willa, the caretaker hired to maintain the property through the winter months. He exhaled, visibly relieved, and introduced himself as an independent appraiser contracted by a Boston real estate firm. He was shivering. The bitter wind coming off the lake cut straight through tailored wool. I offered him a cup of hot coffee from my thermos. He accepted it with eager gratitude, warming his bare hands around the plastic cup. We began to walk the perimeter together. I did not hinder his inspection. In fact, I facilitated it. I wanted his final report to be impeccably accurate. An appraisal is a cornerstone document in a commercial real estate transaction. It anchors the financial value of the fraud. If the report was flawless, the legal weight of the conspiracy would be undeniable. I pointed out the reinforced cedar posts supporting the deck. I explained the peculiar drainage Silas had engineered to keep the basement dry during the spring thaw. I showed him the upgraded copper plumbing I had installed the previous summer, replacing the aging galvanized pipes that threatened to burst. The appraiser took meticulous notes, impressed by my thorough knowledge of the structure. He remarked that it was rare to find our property in this remote area maintained to such exacting standards. I kept my expression neutral, nodding politely. I was maintaining it because it belonged to me. As we moved inside to inspect the electrical panel, the appraiser relaxed. The hot coffee and my cooperative attitude loosened his professional restraint. He began to talk, offering casual insights into the nature of his assignment. He chuckled, shaking his head as he examined the breaker box. He mentioned that the sellers had been incredibly persistent about expediting this visit. He dropped names without realizing the significance. He said Susan and Mason had called his agency twice a day, pushing for a rush order so they could finalize the closing over the holiday weekend. He complained mildly about being dispatched to the freezing woods just days before Thanksgiving, but noted that the sellers were paying a premium rush fee for his time. I smiled, a tight, controlled movement of my lips. I asked him a few polite questions about his drive up from the city, subtly memorizing the logo embossed on his clipboard and the contact information printed on the header of his assessment forms. I filed the name of his agency in my mental ledger. He packed up his measuring tools and thanked me for my assistance. He promised to have the finalized report sent to the Boston buyers and the sellers by Wednesday morning. We shook hands on the front porch. I watched him climb into his heated sedan and drive back down the logging road, taking the definitive legal proof of my family's criminal intent with him. Standing alone on this porch, I allowed the silence of the lake to surround me. A novice might wonder why I let the appraisal happen. Why not reveal the true deed right then and there? Why not expose the lie before the paperwork was processed? The answer lies in the strict legal definition of conspiracy. Merely talking about selling a property you do not own is a bad idea. Taking tangible, documented steps to execute that sale crosses a hard legal threshold. By securing a commercial appraisal, paying a rush fee, and scheduling a holiday closing, Susan and Mason were generating an irrefutable paper trail. They were weaving a net so tight that when the trap finally sprang, no defense attorney in the state of Maine could untangle them. I was meticulously documenting their descent, letting them wade so deep into the mechanics of wire fraud that turning back would be legally impossible. I locked the front door of the cabin, securing the deadbolt. I walked around to the eastern eaves and adjusted the angle of the security camera, ensuring it had a clear, unobstructed view of the driveway for Thursday morning. The perimeter was secure. The monitoring systems were online. I drove back to Portland as the afternoon light faded into a bruised purple dusk. The trap was set, but a fundamental question remained. Why were they risking federal prison for a quick cash sale? Susan was vain and Mason was arrogant, but $1 million expedited real estate fraud requires a level of desperation I had not yet identified. They were moving too fast, accepting too much risk. I needed to find the pressure point driving their timeline. When I returned to my apartment and booted up my workstation, a new flurry of notifications from the secret group chat illuminated my screen. The conversation had shifted away from the cabin walkthrough. Harper was panicking. The frantic tone of her messages provided the missing variable I had been searching for, revealing a sprawling secret that went far beyond the timber walls of Moosehead Lake. Tuesday evening settled over the Maine coastline with a biting wind that rattled the glass of my living room windows. I sat in my darkened office, illuminated only by the sterile glow of my dual monitors. The quiet of the apartment broke when the burner phone vibrated against the wooden desk. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of text notifications. The secret group chat was active again. I unlocked the device and opened the thread. The tenor of the conversation had shifted from smug logistical planning to sheer panic. Harper was flooding the chat with rapid-fire messages. Her usual curated breezy tone was gone, replaced by the frantic keystrokes of someone watching the walls close in. She had received a minor update from the title company regarding a routine processing delay, and the slight schedule adjustment had sent her into a spiral. She typed that if the wire transfer did not clear by Friday afternoon, she was ruined. She followed that statement with a chilling admission. She told our mother that the creditors were preparing to seize her entire inventory by Monday morning. My sister Harper runs a boutique clothing store in downtown Portland. To the casual observer, she is a vibrant, successful entrepreneur. Her social media feeds are curated galleries of imported silk blouses, expensive espresso shots, and effortless coastal elegance. Growing up, Harper was the golden child who could do no wrong. Susan funded her early mistakes, smoothing over missed deadlines and broken commitments with a checkbook and a smile. When Harper decided she wanted to open a retail storefront, Susan heralded her as a prodigy. I always suspected the boutique operated on narrow margins given her extravagant personal spending habits, but I had never looked closely at the actual numbers. The text messages changed my parameters. I needed to understand the exact shape of the desperation driving them to steal my inheritance. I minimized the chat window and opened a fresh, secure browser. I shifted my focus from network security to forensic accounting. Information is rarely hidden. It is usually just filed in places most people never bother to look. I bypassed standard search engines and logged directly into the public portals of the State Business Registry. I pulled the corporate filings for the retail limited liability company Harper owned. The foundational documents looked standard, but the secondary filings told a devastating story of financial ruin. When a business takes on secured debt, the lender files a Uniform Commercial Code financing statement with the Secretary of State. This document publicizes the legal right of the creditor to seize the business assets if the borrower defaults. I ran a query on the company name Harper registered. The results populated my screen in a long, staggering list. There was not just one lien. There were 5. She had not secured traditional bank loans. The entities listed as secured creditors were alternative lending groups that specialize in merchant cash advances. These are predatory financial instruments designed for desperate businesses. They provide immediate capital in exchange for direct daily withdrawals from the company bank account, often at exorbitant interest rates that can exceed 80% annually. Harper had borrowed against her future sales to fund her present lifestyle, locking herself into a death spiral of debt. When the daily draws starved her cash flow, she took out a second advance to pay the first, and then a third to pay the second. The most recent filing was the largest recorded just 3 months prior. I clicked the attached document to view the digital signature page. The contract required a personal guarantor, someone to accept liability, if the business entity failed to repay the debt. There in bold black ink was the signature of my brother Mason. Mason has always craved the status of a wealthy investor without possessing the work ethic required to build actual wealth. He thrives on the illusion of power. When Harper needed a guarantor to secure her final loan, Mason likely saw an opportunity to play the savior. He attached his name to a toxic financial instrument, binding his own financial fate to her collapsing retail facade. If the creditors seized the boutique inventory and dissolved her store, they would immediately execute judgments against Mason, liquidating whatever meager assets he possessed and driving him into bankruptcy. I sat back in my desk chair and stared at the web of interconnected debt spanning my monitors. The motive for the Moosehead Lake conspiracy finally crystallized. Susan was not orchestrating $1 million real estate fraud out of simple casual greed. She was executing a rescue mission. Her 2 favored children were standing on the edge of a catastrophic financial cliff. They were days away from public ruin. Susan, the matriarch who had spent her entire life curating an image of flawless family success, could not tolerate the social humiliation of bankruptcy courts and seized storefronts. She was liquidating my grandfather Silas and his legacy to buy their salvation. Silas had built that cabin with his own hands, hauling fieldstone and cutting pine, dreaming of a sanctuary that would outlast him. Susan was trading the physical embodiment of his hard work to pay off predatory lenders and fund the designer lifestyle Harper refused to abandon. She was sacrificing the history of our family to erase the arrogant mistakes Mason made. The stakes for them were no longer just a stolen holiday weekend. They were fighting for their very survival, and they had decided to use my property as their life raft. This revelation fundamentally altered my operational strategy. A crime of greed is unpredictable, but a crime of desperation operates on a strict, unyielding timeline. They needed that cash wire by Monday morning to satisfy the merchant cash advance creditors before the seizure notices were executed. They were backed into a corner, which meant they would not hesitate to destroy anyone who stood between them and that money. For a brief, fleeting moment, the ingrained habits of my childhood surfaced. For years, I had been the silent fixer. When things broke, I repaired them. When bills went unpaid, I quietly covered the margins. A part of me looked at the financial wreckage on my screen and felt the old familiar urge to step in and stabilize the system. I had substantial savings. I had a high-paying tech salary. If I walked into the boutique right now and revealed that I knew about the debt, I could potentially stop the fraud. I knew exactly how that scenario would play out. If I confronted them with the truth, the tears would flow immediately. Susan would weep, citing maternal panic. Harper would collapse into a dramatic display of remorse, claiming she was in over her head and terrified. Mason would deflect, insisting he was only trying to help his sister. They would surround me with a chorus of manufactured grief. Once the tears subsided, the emotional extortion would begin. They would turn the blame outward. They would argue that if I truly cared about my family, I would pay the debts out of my own savings to save them from ruin. They would weaponize my financial stability, demanding I drain my own accounts to reward their reckless behavior. They would use my grandfather against me, insisting Silas would want the family to stick together in a crisis. They would twist the narrative until I was the villain for refusing to hand over my paycheck. I could not allow them to drag me into their drowning pool. This realization hardened my resolve into something impenetrable. I had to sever the emotional ties entirely. You cannot negotiate with a threat actor who views your existence purely as a resource to be consumed. I could no longer treat them as a mother, a brother, and a sister. They were hostile entities attempting to breach my secured assets. I closed the browser windows containing the lien filings and cleared my search history. I would not offer them a tearful confrontation. I would not give them the opportunity to beg for my salary. I would rely solely on the cold, unforgiving reality of property law. The trust deed in my fireproof safe did not care about boutique inventory or vanity. It only cared about rigid, documented ownership. I would let them proceed with their fake Thanksgiving. Knowing every step they took toward that closing table was a step deeper into a trap of their own making. As I prepared for bed, my phone screen remained dark, but I knew the quiet would not last. The morning would inevitably bring a new tactic to keep their desperate plan afloat. Wednesday morning brought a bitter chill off the Atlantic Ocean, turning the sky over Portland the color of bruised iron. I stood in my kitchen waiting for the espresso machine to finish its cycle, feeling the distinct lingering tension of a looming deadline. The holiday was tomorrow. The operation was in its final stages. My personal cell phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The screen displayed a photograph I had taken years ago. It was an image of my mother Susan smiling her practiced camera-ready smile. In cybersecurity, professionals spend a lot of time discussing social engineering. It is the art of manipulating people, so they willingly give up confidential information or valuable assets. Hackers know that human beings are the weakest link in any security protocol. You do not need to crack a firewall if you can simply convince the user to hand over their password. Susan was a master of social engineering long before the internet existed. She knew exactly how to bypass my logical defenses by exploiting ingrained emotional conditioning. I tapped the screen to answer and simultaneously pressed the record button on a secondary audio application running on my tablet. I am a firm believer in keeping a detailed log of every transaction. Willa, she sighed into the receiver. The sigh was a masterpiece of auditory theater. It conveyed a profound, world-weary exhaustion, designed to make the listener feel an immediate suffocating obligation to alleviate her burden. "I'm so glad I caught you before you logged on for work," she said. I kept my voice neutral, offering a generic morning greeting. I listened as she spun her web, noting the precise modulation of her tone. "It has been a disaster of a morning." Susan continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Harper's car broke down on her way to the boutique. The mechanic says the transmission is failing. It is a $1,200 repair and they need the money today to order the parts." I stood perfectly still, letting the heat of the espresso cup warm my palm. The breathtaking audacity of the request washed over me. At this exact moment, she was actively coordinating a fraudulent real estate closing to liquidate a historic lakeside cabin I owned. She was conspiring to steal over $1 million from my portfolio. Yet while orchestrating grand larceny, she found the time to call me and extort a fraction of my paycheck to cover Harper's daily expenses. "Your sister is just so stressed." Susan pressed, tightening the emotional screws. "She has so much on her plate with the store. As the one with the stable tech job, could you just float her the money? You know how it is. Family takes care of family. Family takes care of family." That phrase was the foundational myth of my childhood. It was the incantation Susan used whenever she needed to balance the ledger of her favored children using my resources. When Mason wrecked his first car, family duty meant I had to surrender my summer savings to cover his insurance deductible. When Harper wanted a designer laptop for college, family duty dictated that I co-sign the financing agreement because my credit score was pristine. I had spent a decade functioning as their silent, reliable banking institution. I analyzed the current request from a tactical perspective. Harper was ostensibly days away from receiving a huge influx of illicit cash from the Moosehead Lake sale. Why badger me for a car repair right now? The answer crystallized with cold precision. Susan was executing a resource drain. Legal battles require immediate liquidity. Retainers for competent real estate litigators in Maine are expensive. By forcing me to empty my checking account to fix Harper's car, Susan was ensuring I lacked the operational capital to hire an attorney if I somehow discovered the Thanksgiving plot early. She was neutralizing my ability to strike back. My finger hovered over the red icon to terminate the call. Hanging up would be deeply satisfying, but it would also signal defiance. I needed to maintain my cover. I mirrored her tone, injecting my voice with a perfectly calibrated sense of regret. "I am so sorry to hear about the car, Mom," I said smoothly. "But I do not have the liquidity right now. I just locked my savings into a long-term certificate of deposit, and my checking account is tied up with rent and utilities." I did not stop there. I lobbed the problem back into her designated territory, targeting the fiction she had built around my brother. "I am sure Mason can help her out," I added. "He just closed that big commercial deal he was bragging about last month, right? $1,200 should be pocket change for him." The silence on the line turned icy. The temperature of the conversation plummeted. The manufactured warmth vanished, replaced by the rigid, unyielding entitlement that formed the core of her personality. I had broken the script. The scapegoat had refused the assignment and dared to highlight the golden child's fictional success. "You have always been so selfish, Willa," she snapped. Her voice was sharp, a serrated edge designed to inflict maximum guilt. "I ask you for one simple favor to help your sister and you turn your back on us. Enjoy your diner meal tomorrow." The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone. I saved the audio recording to my encrypted drive, filing it alongside the forged quitclaim deed and the illicit text logs. I played the phrase back in my mind. "You have always been so selfish." For years, that accusation would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have transferred the funds immediately, desperate to prove her wrong, eager to buy my way back into her good graces. I would have compromised my own financial security just to hear her say thank you. Not today. Her insult was the final emotional tether breaking. When someone calls you selfish for refusing to be exploited, they are simply mourning the loss of their control over you. Susan did not love me. She loved my utility. She loved my compliance. The moment I removed my compliance, I ceased to have value in her ecosystem. It was a liberating realization. I owed these people nothing. No loyalty, no money, and certainly no mercy. I drank my espresso, my hands perfectly steady. The emotional warfare had failed, leaving only the tactical reality of the battlefield. My family was supplying the forged paperwork, but they needed a buyer willing to fund the transaction. I needed to know exactly who was bringing $1 million in cash to Moosehead Lake on Thanksgiving Day. I set my coffee down and opened a secure terminal on my workstation. It was time to investigate the Boston Holding Company. I spent Wednesday afternoon running open-source intelligence protocols on the buyer listed in the fraudulent purchase agreement. The name on the contract was a generic corporate entity registered as North Point Holdings, LLC. In the commercial real estate sector, holding companies act as digital shell games. They exist to obscure the true identity of the primary investor and shield the parent corporation from immediate legal liability. Tracing them requires patience and a systematic approach to public records. I queried the Delaware Division of Corporations, cross-referenced the registered agent, and followed the paper trail through 2 more shell entities. The chain finally terminated at a prominent address in the financial district of Boston. The true buyer was not a wealthy family looking for a quiet summer retreat. It was a sprawling luxury development firm known for ruthless coastal gentrification. They specialized in acquiring rustic remote properties, leveling the original structures and replacing them with high-end seasonal rentals. I logged into the municipal planning database for our county in Maine. Property variances and environmental impact assessments are public records if you possess the correct parcel identification number. I bypassed the standard web interface, accessing the raw directory index to pull the most recent filings associated with the Moosehead Lake property line. The files had been uploaded mere days ago. I downloaded a compressed folder containing high-resolution architectural renderings and site blueprints. I opened the computer-aided design files on my secondary monitor. The visual representation on the screen was a desecration. My grandfather Silas had spent 3 years clearing the specific footprint for our camp. He selected a natural depression in the shoreline, ensuring the roofline sat below the canopy of the old-growth pines. He wanted the cabin to feel like it had grown organically out of the earth. He used untreated cedar that weathered to a soft gray, blending into the surrounding timber. The camp culture of Maine relies on a deep, unspoken respect for the woods. You build to inhabit the landscape, not to dominate it. You maintain the timber, you protect the watershed, and you leave the shoreline intact for the next generation. The Boston developer intended to erase all of it. Their blueprints depicted an imposing, sterile structure composed of sheer glass and steel. The new design cantilevered over the water, featuring a sprawling concrete observation deck that required clear-cutting the ancient pines anchoring the shoreline. They planned to tear down Silas's handcrafted fieldstone chimney, a structure he built by hauling smooth river rocks up the embankment by hand. The developer intended to replace it with a sleek, automated gas fire feature controlled by a smartphone application. The cabin was going to be stripped of its soul and transformed into a generic luxury commodity. Maine maintains strict shoreland zoning laws designed to protect the lakes from this exact type of overdevelopment. Property owners are generally prohibited from building new structures within 100 feet of the high water mark. However, the developer had found a loophole. The municipal filings detailed a plan to classify the demolition as a non-conforming structure expansion. By leaving a single fractional portion of the original foundation intact during the initial excavation phase, they could legally argue they were merely renovating an existing footprint. They were going to bulldoze my grandfather's legacy and use a bureaucratic technicality to justify the destruction. My family was not simply liquidating an asset to cover Harper's debts. Susan and Mason were signing the death warrant for the only piece of authentic history our family possessed. They were trading the physical embodiment of Silas's labor for a quick wire transfer, indifferent to the fact that the cabin would be reduced to splintered kindling by the end of the year. This revelation shifted the internal equilibrium of my response. The crime was no longer just a personal financial betrayal. It had escalated into a profound desecration of my grandfather's memory. Susan was willing to let bulldozers crush the walls her own father built, just so her favorite daughter could keep selling imported silk blouses in Portland. I scrutinized the correspondence attached to the municipal filings. The developer was operating on an accelerated timeline, anxious to secure municipal approval before the ground froze solid for the winter. An email from the lead project manager detailed the itinerary for the Thanksgiving holiday. The developer was not traveling to Maine alone. He was bringing his chief architect to the fake Thanksgiving dinner. They planned to use the holiday walkthrough to finalize the demolition sight lines, tag the old growth trees for removal, and measure the exact grade of the shoreline. The grotesque nature of the gathering crystallized in my mind. Susan was going to host a catered celebration serving turkey and pouring wine for the very men hired to destroy her father's work. She would smile and play the gracious host while the architect walked through the living room calculating how many dumpsters it would take to haul away the cedar floorboards. The Thanksgiving dinner was actually a demolition consultation disguised as a holiday. I routed the architectural files to my laser printer. I listened to the rhythmic hum of the machine as it processed the detailed drawings. Digital evidence is pristine, but it lacks tactical weight. In a confrontation, a screen can be dismissed, closed, or ignored by people who refuse to engage with the facts. Paper demands acknowledgement. A printed document forces the viewer to confront the physical reality of their actions. I watch the pages fall into the output tray, each sheet bearing the sterile geometric lines of the proposed glass structure. The contrast between the cold ink on the page and the warm wood of the actual cabin made my chest tighten. I gathered the stack of blueprints and tapped the edges against my desk to align them perfectly. I retrieved a thick manila envelope from my supply drawer. I slid the demolition plans inside, folding the metal clasp down to secure the flap. I walked over to my grandfather's weathered leather work bag resting on the corner of my desk. The bag already contained the encrypted drive, the printed chat logs, the fraudulent quitclaim deed, and the authentic trust document proving my ownership. I unzipped the main compartment and placed the manila envelope alongside the other files. The aged leather groaned softly under the added weight as I adjusted the contents. The trap was now fully stocked and armed. The paperwork guillotine was sharpened and waiting for the executioner to pull the lever. My family thought they had orchestrated the perfect seasonal heist. They believed their quiet, reliable sister was safely neutralized in Portland, preparing to eat a solitary dinner, while they secured their financial salvation on the lake. They felt secure in their deception, confident that they had bypassed every obstacle. They had no idea that I held the architectural blueprint of their entire conspiracy sitting in the bag my grandfather used to carry his tools. I checked the battery levels on my portable surveillance monitors, ensuring they were fully charged for remote field operation. I packed a heavy insulated thermos and a set of thermal layers. The temperature in the northern woods would drop well below freezing by dawn, and I needed to remain completely undetected in the tree line. I laid out Silas's heavy wool coat on the edge of my bed. The preparations were complete. I had gathered the data, secured the perimeter, and defined the consequences. The evidence was irrefutable, and the emotional tether to my family had been cleanly severed. There was nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise on Thanksgiving morning. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a biting, brittle frost that coated Portland in a thin layer of white ice. I did not drive toward the decoy diner on the edge of town. I turned my vehicle north, merging onto the interstate long before the sun crested the horizon. The heater in my sedan struggled against the plunging temperature as the coastal highway gave way to the dense, dark stretches of northern timberland. I navigated the familiar route purely on muscle memory. My mind focused entirely on the execution of the operation. By the time I crossed into the county lines surrounding Moosehead Lake, the sky had turned a pale, fractured gray. I bypassed the main county road leading to the camp. Instead, I guided my vehicle down an overgrown logging path located 2 miles away, parking behind a dense thicket of frosted spruce trees. I stepped out into the freezing, the sharp cold burning the back of my throat. I pulled my grandfather Silas's heavy wool coat tight around my shoulders and slung his weathered leather work bag across my chest. The hike through the woods was brutal. The underbrush was frozen solid, snapping like brittle bone under my boots. I moved carefully, avoiding the game trails hunters used, sticking to the steep rocky ridges that offered better cover. Silas had taught me how to walk these woods without leaving a trace, and I used every lesson he gave me to navigate the treacherous terrain in silence. It took nearly an hour of grueling exertion to reach the designated vantage point. I positioned myself on a rocky outcropping situated across the narrow cove, elevated just enough to provide an unobstructed view of the cabin and the graveled driveway. The frigid dirt seeped through the knees of my denim jeans, but I ignored the discomfort. I unzipped the leather bag and extracted my primary laptop. My fingers were stiff from the bitter chill as I tethered the computer to my encrypted mobile hotspot. Within seconds, the screen flickered to life. I authenticated my credentials and accessed the live high-definition feeds from the security lenses I had installed beneath the cabin eaves. The digital clock in the corner of my screen ticked toward 10 in the morning. The crunch of tires on gravel echoed across the cove, carrying perfectly over the frozen, still water. My mother, Susan, navigated her pristine white sport utility vehicle down the long driveway, parking directly in front of the porch. Mason and Harper emerged from the passenger doors. They did not look like people preparing for a holiday meal of gratitude. They looked like looters arriving at a bank vault. Harper carried a small, prepackaged turkey in a plastic grocery bag, treating it like a mandatory prop for a theatrical production. Mason carried 2 expensive bottles of champagne, his posture radiating a smug, unearned victory. Susan stepped out last, wrapped in a designer cashmere scarf, surveying the property with the calculating gaze of an accountant tallying a ledger, watching them from this freezing dirt across the water. The sheer audacity of their performance struck a deep nerve. They were preparing to host a celebration of their own treason. They walked up the wooden steps Silas had built, laughing and joking, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They unlocked the front door using the keypad code I had maintained, stepping into the warmth of the cabin I had winterized with my own paycheck. They arranged their meager grocery store purchases on the handmade oak table, setting the stage for the buyers. They were treating the desecration of our family history as a triumphant business maneuver. 30 minutes later, a sleek black luxury vehicle turned off the main road. The heavy tires chewed through the frosted gravel as the Range Rover pulled into the yard, parking alongside Susan's vehicle. 2 men in expensive winter tailoring stepped out into the cold. I recognized the lead developer from the corporate profiles I had researched. The second man carried a thick tube of rolled documents confirming his role as the chief architect. Susan exited the cabin first, projecting her most polished, deferential hostess persona. She descended the steps with her hands outstretched, greeting the men with enthusiastic warmth. Mason followed closely behind, puffing out his chest, desperate to appear as a legitimate peer to the wealthy Boston executives. I watched the interaction unfold through the sharp resolution of my security cameras. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and immediately began pointing at various structural elements of the cabin. The architect unrolled a large sheets of paper across the hood of the Range Rover. Even from across the cove, the sequence of events was unmistakable. Mason gestured toward the fieldstone chimney, tracing a wide arc with his arm to indicate the demolition zone. He was actively highlighting the tear-down value of the structure, pointing out how easily heavy machinery could clear the old growth pines along the shoreline. Harper stood on the porch, sipping coffee from a ceramic mug, wholly indifferent to the fact that her family was signing the death warrant for the only piece of true heritage she possessed. My heart pounded against my ribs, a heavy rhythmic thud that echoed in my ears, but my hands remained steady on the keyboard. I felt the distinct cold clarity that always accompanies a critical security event. In information security, you often have to sit still while malicious software infiltrates a network. You watch the virus bypass the outer defenses, moving methodically through the file directories, gathering the data it intends to steal. You do not intervene prematurely. Intervening too early simply teaches the hostile actor how to evade your detection the next time. You have to wait for the payload to execute. You have to let them initiate the final extraction protocol, because that is the exact moment they expose their entire architecture to your tracing tools. My family was deploying their malware in real time. They had breached the perimeter, initiated the fraudulent negotiation, and brought the hostile buyers to the target location. The Thanksgiving dinner was merely a social wrapper hiding a catastrophic legal maneuver. They believed their operation was flawless. They thought I was sitting in a rundown diner 2 hours away, ignorant and isolated. They had no idea I was sitting in the freezing dirt less than a mile away, logging every handshake, every pointed finger, and every structural measurement the architect took. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the impending finality of the transaction. The group gathered up their architectural plans and moved toward the front door, preparing to conduct the interior inspection. The final closing documents would be waiting for them on the kitchen counter. My finger rested lightly on the touchpad of my laptop, prepared to execute my countermeasures. I needed the definitive proof of their forgery to hit the public record before I stepped out of the woods. The developer was ready to sign, but the legal mechanism transferring the property required an official seal. The trap was ready, but the sudden vibration of my phone signaling an incoming message from a county contact would reveal a complication that shifted the entire legal landscape of the day. The heavy oak door of the cabin clicked shut, swallowing the developer, the architect, and my family into the warm interior. I remained on the frozen ridge across the cove, the icy wind numbing my cheeks. The trap was primed. The targets were inside the perimeter, and I was waiting for the final execution phase. Right at that critical juncture, the encrypted secondary phone resting in my pocket vibrated a sharp, sustained buzz that signaled an incoming high-priority transmission. I kept my eyes on the distant windows of the camp while I retrieved the device. The message was from Martha Higgins. Martha is a senior administrator at the county clerk office, a woman who has filed property records in this jurisdiction for over 30 years. More importantly, she knew my grandfather. Decades ago, during a brutal storm that knocked out power across the region, Silas had driven his truck through 3 feet of snow to deliver a generator to Martha's property, keeping her pipes from bursting. In rural Maine, you do not forget a gesture like that. The culture here runs on a quiet, enduring ledger of mutual reliance. Earlier in the week, I had placed a discreet call to her direct line. I asked her to monitor the incoming queues for any preliminary municipal filings attached to the Moosehead Lake parcel number. Waterfront real estate transfers in this state require specific disclosures to ensure compliance with environmental and zoning ordinances, and those documents often hit the clerk's desk days before a formal closing. I needed to know exactly what paper trail my family was attempting to establish. The text message contained a single secure file attachment. I tethered the download through my proxy network, ensuring no trace of the data transfer could be intercepted. The image loaded on my screen, cutting through the glare of the morning sun. It was a scanned copy of a notice of intent to sell. The bureaucratic form laid out the stark, calculated mechanics of their theft. The document listed the parcel identification numbers, the acreage boundaries, and the designated buyer as North Point Holdings. Seeing the cold official type spelling out the liquidation of my grandfather's legacy induced a sharp, localized pain in my chest. They were dismantling his life's work and packaging it into a sterile municipal file. I scrolled to the bottom of the page to inspect the signature block. Just as I had seen on the drafted quitclaim deed a few days prior, Silas's name was etched onto the signature line. The forged ink strokes mimicked his distinct handwriting, a digital phantom pasted onto the document by my brother. But my attention quickly shifted away from the counterfeit signature. A new element had been introduced, one that fundamentally escalated the severity of their actions. Stamped directly over the forged signature was a circular official notary seal. In the real estate sector, a notary public serves as the definitive line of defense against identity theft and property fraud. The state entrusts them with a sworn duty to verify the physical identity of the person signing a legal document. They must examine government-issued identification, look the signer in the eye, and physically witness the pen touching the paper. Applying a notary seal to a signature you did not witness is a severe violation of public trust. Applying it to the forged signature of a deceased man is a direct ticket to federal prison. I zoomed in on the scanned image, enhancing the resolution until the embossed lettering of the notary seal became legible. The name inside the purple ink circle read, Dennis Caldwell. A bitter, cynical realization washed over me. I recognized that name immediately. Dennis Caldwell was not a random official selected from a public directory. He was a lingering ghost from Mason's chaotic financial past. Years ago, during Mason's disastrous attempt to launch an artisanal brewery in Portland, he had surrounded himself with a network of sycophants and corner-cutting opportunists. Dennis was one of those fringe associates. How was a man who drove flashy leased sports cars and always seemed to possess a convenient, flexible interpretation of regulatory compliance. When Mason needed dubious zoning applications rushed through the system, Dennis was the guy who stamped the paperwork. Mason had retreated to his old habits. In his arrogant rush to secure the Boston developer's cash, he had bypassed legitimate legal channels. He knew an honest notary would demand to see Silas in person, which was an impossible hurdle. So Mason reached out to his compromised associate. He brought a forged document to a licensed official, and Dennis Caldwell, likely motivated by the promise of a lucrative kickback from the $1 million sale, applied his state-sanctioned seal to a lie. This discovery changed the entire geometry of the conflict. Until this moment, I had been dealing with a treacherous family dispute. Susan Mason and Harper were conspiring to commit fraud, but their actions were contained within our toxic familial ecosystem. The introduction of Dennis Caldwell transformed their scheme into a multi-party criminal conspiracy. They had colluded with a licensed state official to validate a fraudulent federal instrument. The charges were no longer limited to simple theft or attempted wire fraud. They had ventured into the realm of racketeering, official misconduct, and organized financial crime. They had built their entire house of cards on a foundation of documented, irrefutable felonies. By involving a corrupt notary, Mason had inadvertently constructed the exact mechanism required to destroy them all. I saved the high-resolution scan of the notarized document directly to my encrypted cold storage drive. I organized the file alongside the digital metadata, the architectural demolition blueprints, and the audio recording of my mother attempting to extort my paycheck. The evidence locker was overflowing. I possessed every single puzzle piece required to prove their guilt, neatly packaged and ready for deployment. I looked across the frozen cove. Inside the cabin, the holiday charade was undoubtedly in full swing. I could picture Susan pouring champagne into crystal flutes, flashing her most charming, deferential smile at the Boston developer. I could envision Mason leaning against the fieldstone fireplace, acting the part of the rugged, successful landowner, negotiating a prime coastal deal. Harper was likely hovering near the windows, calculating how quickly the wire transfer would hit her bank account, dreaming of the predatory creditors she was about to pay off. They believed they were outsmarting their quiet, overworked sister. They thought I was sitting in a depressing diner 2 hours south, eating a dry turkey sandwich and mourning my exclusion from the family table. They felt powerful, secure, and victorious. They were entirely unaware that they had just handed me the precise legal leverage needed to dismantle their lives. The appraiser had verified the structural value. The architect had confirmed the demolition sight lines. The corrupt notary had validated the forged intent to sell. The threat actors had executed every single step of their malicious payload, leaving an undeniable trail of evidence in their wake. The reconnaissance phase of my operation was officially over. It was time to trigger the firewall. I minimized the secure document viewer on my screen and opened the messaging application. I pulled up the secret group chat, the digital room where they had plotted my humiliation and the theft of my inheritance. The gray bubbles sat dormant, silent since Harper's frantic messages the night before. I rested my freezing fingertips on the keyboard, watching the silhouettes of my family move past the living room windows of the camp. The buyers were inside. The documents were likely sitting on the kitchen counter, waiting for the final signatures. The moment of maximum exposure had arrived. The digital clock in the corner of my screen turned to 11:45 in the morning. The sun had finally burned through the overcast Maine sky, casting a sharp, blinding glare across the frozen surface of Moosehead Lake. Through the high-definition video feed, I watched the heavy wooden front door of the cabin swing open. The group spilled out onto the wraparound porch. Silas had built that porch facing east to catch the morning light, sanding the pine boards by hand, so our bare feet would never catch a splinter during the summer months. Now it was serving as the staging ground for a corporate liquidation. Mason walked out first, projecting the swagger of a seasoned broker closing a career. Defining transaction. The crisp winter air plumed around his face as he laughed at a joke the developer made. Behind them, Susan hovered with a tray of fresh coffee, playing the role of the gracious rural host. Harper lingered near the railing, her phone clutched in one hand while she stared out at the water, likely calculating how many hours remained until her predatory creditors were satisfied. They gathered around the rustic cedar table Silas used for cleaning trout. Mason unbuttoned his expensive wool overcoat and reached into his inner pocket. He produced a thick manila folder. Even from across the cove, I recognized the heft of the paperwork. These were the closing documents. The fraudulent quitclaim deed, the false disclosures, and the notarized lies. He laid the folder flat on the table, smoothing the cover with the palm of his hand. The Boston developer leaned over the table, nodding in agreement, as Mason pointed to the signature lines. The architect stood a few paces back, observing the timber roofline, likely visualizing the heavy machinery tearing through the rafters. I watched the developer reach into his tailored jacket and withdraw a silver fountain pen. He uncapped it with a smooth, practiced motion. The ink was seconds away from touching the paper. In cybersecurity, this is the exact threshold of a critical failure. It is the fraction of a second before the malicious script binds to the operating system and encrypts the hard drive. Once that pen signed the documents, the legal entanglement would require years of expensive litigation to unwind. I could not let the ink touch the page. The observation phase had concluded. It was time to deploy the countermeasure. I shifted my focus from the live video feed to my encrypted mobile device. I opened the messaging application and navigated to the secret group chat. The thread titled Operation Turkey Drop sat quiet dormant, since Harper had voiced her panic over her collapsing boutique inventory the previous evening. My fingers were stiff from the bitter cold, but my keystrokes were precise and deliberate. I accessed my secure storage drive and selected the 3 specific files required to dismantle their conspiracy. I did not need to write a lengthy explanation. I did not need to express my anger or list my grievances. Data is infinitely more devastating than emotion. I queued the attachments in a carefully designed sequence, tailoring the digital payload to inflict maximum psychological impact. First, I uploaded the scanned image of the notice of intent to sell, featuring Mason's forged replication of Silas's signature and the corrupt notary stamp from Dennis Caldwell. This established their vulnerability, proving I possessed undeniable evidence of their federal crimes. Next, I attached the PDF of the developer's architectural blueprints, the ones detailing the glass and steel structure that would replace the cabin. This demonstrated that I knew the true scope of their betrayal, that they were not just selling the land, but actively authorizing the destruction of our heritage. Finally, I uploaded the high-resolution photograph of the authentic county-stamped irrevocable trust deed. The document clearly designated Willa Gerson as the sole legal owner and trustee of the Moosehead Lake property. This was the kill switch. This single image negated every piece of paper sitting on that cedar table. The 3 files compressed and loaded into the chat window. I stared at the screen, feeling the cold wind bite through the collar of my grandfather's coat. For 10 years, I had been the silent, reliable foundation of this family. I had absorbed their demands, covered their debts, and endured their quiet disdain. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had assumed my boundaries were negotiable. I tapped the text field and typed a single final sentence to accompany the files. Happy Thanksgiving. Your lawyer will explain the rest. I pressed send. The progress bar flashed across the top of my screen, green and instantaneous. The data transmitted through the cellular towers beamed across the frozen lake and landed directly in their pockets. I immediately locked my eyes onto the live video feed on my laptop monitor. The delay was minimal, perhaps 2 seconds. On the porch, Harper was the first to receive the notification. Her phone illuminated in her hand. The sharp ping echoed faintly across the water, carrying through the crisp winter air. She raised the screen to her face. I watched the physical manifestation of a systemic collapse. Harper froze. The effortless, curated posture she maintained for her social media presence evaporated. The color visibly drained from her face, leaving her pale and rigid as if she had just stepped on a live wire. She scrolled down her thumb, moving frantically across the glass as she processed the forged signature, the demolition plans, and finally the authentic deed. Her hand began to shake. She stepped forward and tapped Susan on the shoulder. My mother turned, a scowl flashing across her features at the interruption before her eyes darted down to the screen. Harper thrust into her hands. "Susan, read the message." The polished, gracious hostess smile she had plastered on her face for the Boston executives disintegrated. It did not fade. It shattered, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her shoulders slumped and she stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Mason, noticing the sudden commotion, looked up from the closing documents. He asked a question, his confusion evident even without audio. Susan shoved the phone toward his chest. Mason grabbed it. As his eyes scanned the attachment, his arrogant bravado vanished. His jaw dropped. The silver pen he had just borrowed from the developer slipped from his fingers, clattering against the cedar table and rolling onto the floorboards. The developer, sensing the sudden catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, took a slow, deliberate step back from the table. He was a seasoned businessman, and his instinct for self-preservation kicked in immediately. He looked at the trembling family, his eyes narrowing in suspicion, recognizing that a seemingly perfect real estate deal had just imploded in front of him. The breach was contained. The hostile network was effectively locked down. The fraudulent transaction had been halted mere seconds before execution, and the perpetrators were paralyzed by the sudden exposure of their crimes. They were trapped on a porch in the middle of the Maine woods, holding a folder full of worthless paper, staring at the digital proof of their own demise. I did not linger to watch their panic unfold on the screen. The digital phase of the operation was over. The physical confrontation remained. I closed the lid of my laptop, severing the video feed. I packed the computer into the weathered leather work bag, securing the brass buckles with quiet efficiency. I stood up from the freezing dirt. My joints ached from the cold, but my mind was remarkably clear. I brushed the pine needles from my knees and pulled my grandfather's coat tighter around my chest. I turned my back on the ridge and began the treacherous hike down the steep embankment, navigating the frozen underbrush toward the edge of the lake. It was a 2-mile walk to the property line. I took my time, letting the silence of the woods prepare me for the reckoning waiting at the end of the gravel driveway. The journey from the rocky ridge down to the shoreline demanded singular focus. I navigated the steep incline, my boots digging into the frozen earth to maintain traction against the slippery layer of frost. The temperature hovered in the low 20s, but the steady physical exertion kept the cold at bay. I walked along the perimeter of the lake, tracing the exact boundary lines my grandfather had surveyed 1,000 times. The ice along the water edge cracked under the shifting current. It produced a sharp fracturing sound that mirrored the imminent dismantling of my family. I moved with deliberate caution, utilizing the dense thickets of spruce and fir trees for cover. Silas had taught me how to walk these woods without snapping a twig, a skill born from years of tracking deer through the harsh Maine winters. Today, I was tracking something far more destructive. It took exactly 20 minutes to breach the heavy timberline separating the deep woods from our gravel driveway. I paused behind a cluster of mature birch trees to assess the situation before exposing my position. The scene unfolding on the wraparound porch had descended into unrestrained disarray. The illusion of a civilized holiday gathering had fractured the moment my text message arrived on their devices. The Boston developer stood near the cedar table, his face flushed a deep, furious shade of red. He jabbed his finger repeatedly at the manila folder resting on the wood, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen yard. He demanded to know why the sellers were suddenly refusing to execute the closing documents. He had driven several hours from the city, mobilized his chief architect on Thanksgiving Day, and now faced an inexplicable, maddening delay. The architect stood near the railing, clutching his rolled blueprints against his chest, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the escalating hostility. He kept glancing toward the driveway, clearly eager to escape the deteriorating situation. Mason, the self-proclaimed real estate prodigy, had lost all semblance of composure. He paced the length of the porch, running his hands over his face, unable to formulate a coherent response to the executive shouting at him. Growing up, Mason always relied on his smooth cadence and manufactured charm to talk his way out of missed deadlines and broken promises. He was the golden son who believed rules applied only to other people. Facing a seasoned corporate buyer, demanding a signature on a forged document, his usual tactics evaporated. The arrogance he projected only moments earlier had shattered, leaving behind the frantic, aimless energy of a man realizing the trap had closed. He lacked the vocabulary to explain federal crimes to a furious investor. Susan stood near the heavy wooden front door, furiously tapping the glass screen of her smartphone. She held the device to her ear, listening for a brief second before pulling it away in sheer frustration. She was dialing my number repeatedly, desperate to reach the one person she believed she could still control. My phone remained silent in my coat pocket, securely locked in the do not disturb mode. Her social engineering tactics required a willing target, and she was discovering the terrifying reality of a disconnected line. Harper had retreated to the far corner of the deck. She wrapped her arms tightly around her chest, staring blankly at the floorboards. The impending financial ruin she had tried so desperately to evade by sacrificing my inheritance was now standing right in front of her. Her boutique, her creditors, and her curated lifestyle were all collapsing while she shivered in the cold. I adjusted the strap of the weathered leather bag across my shoulder. I stepped out from the cover of the birch trees, my boots crunching loud and deliberate against the frosted gravel. The sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the shouting on the porch. The developer stopped talking. The architect turned his head. Mason halted mid-stride. Susan lowered her phone, her eyes widening as they locked onto my approaching figure. The silence that fell over the property possessed a dense, suffocating quality. It felt heavier than the winter air. I walked up the driveway, closing the distance at a measured, unhurried pace. I wore the heavy wool coat Silas used to wear during the brutal nor'easter storms, the fabric smelling faintly of cedar wood and engine oil. The visual impact of my arrival registered on their faces in real time. They had spent weeks carefully constructing a fictional reality where I was oblivious, sitting in a strip mall diner 2 hours south. The sudden materialization of their primary target on the very land they were attempting to steal short-circuited their cognitive processing. I was not the naive scapegoat they envisioned. I was the architect of their downfall, arriving to collect the debt. Susan took a hesitant step forward. Her meticulously styled hair seemed out of place against her trembling, defeated posture. The polished hostess facade had crumbled entirely, revealing the panicked extortionist underneath. "Willa," she gasped. Her voice was barely a whisper, carrying a fragile, erratic tremor that I had never heard before. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be in Portland." I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of emotion. In crisis management, the person who controls the baseline controls the entire room. If you project panic, the adversary feeds on the chaos. If you project cold, unyielding stability, the adversary breaks against it. I maintained a flat, clinical tone, looking directly into her eyes. "I am securing my perimeter, Susan," I said. I continued walking, ascending the wooden steps my grandfather had built. My boots echoed against the thick pine boards. The physical presence of the heavy wool coat and the leather work bag seemed to occupy the entire space. My family parted instinctively, creating a clear path for me toward the cedar table. I did not look at Mason. I ignored Harper. I turned my attention directly to the Boston developer. The man stood his ground, evaluating me with the sharp, calculating gaze of a corporate executive. He looked from my practical winter boots to the leather satchel, trying to determine my precise role in the sudden collapse of his acquisition. I was accustomed to dictating the terms of every negotiation, bulldozing through opposition with financial leverage. I did not give him time to formulate a question or attempt to establish dominance. "I am Willa Gerson," I stated clearly, ensuring every syllable carried the uncompromising weight of the law. "I am the sole legal owner of this property. These people do not have the right to sell you this land, and if you sign that paperwork, you will be an accessory to real estate fraud." The developer stared at me, the rigid lines of his face tightening. He looked down at the manila folder resting on the table, the forged quitclaim deed exposed to the winter air. The severe legal implications of my statement calculated behind his eyes. He realized in an instant that he had been dragged into a felony conspiracy. The anger he had directed at Mason a moment ago shifted into a dangerous, litigious fury. He turned toward my mother, the thin veneer of professional courtesy stripped away entirely. his posture shifting into a hostile stance that signaled the beginning of an entirely different kind of war. The developer turned his attention from me to Mason. The shift in his posture signaled a dangerous escalation. He was a man who moved millions of dollars through corporate shell entities before breakfast, and he did not appreciate being placed in the center of a rural property scam. He stepped toward my brother, his voice dropping an octave into a harsh, demanding register. He asked Mason if my claims were true. Mason stammered, taking a reflexive step backward, until his spine hit the wooden railing of the porch. For his entire adult life, Mason relied on a specific brand of manufactured charm to navigate the consequences of his actions. When his first startup collapsed and he owed investors thousands of dollars, he talked his way into an extension by playing the visionary entrepreneur who just needed more time. When he damaged a rental car during a weekend trip, he charmed the insurance adjuster into waiving the penalties. He inherently believed that reality was pliable, that any rigid boundary could be bent if he simply projected enough confidence. He attempted to deploy that same tactic now, flashing a tight, unconvincing smile at the developer. He gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. He told the developer that I was just confused, claiming the property was still in our grandfather's name, and that I misunderstood the legal probate process. He tried to paint the picture of a stressed, overworked younger sister suffering from a breakdown under the pressure of her technology job. It was the classic family script designed to invalidate my voice and restore his authority. I ignored his performance. I did not engage in a debate. I stepped up to the rustic cedar table standing right next to the forged closing documents they had prepared. I unclasped the brass buckles of Silas's weathered leather work bag. The heavy leather groaned in the freezing morning air. I reached inside and bypassed the laptop, wrapping my fingers around the thick red cardboard folder containing the authentic records. I pulled out the certified county stamped deed. I placed it flat on the wooden table, positioning it right next to Mason's fabricated quitclaim document. The contrast between the two papers was stark. My deed carried the embossed seal of the Maine County Clerk, the ink heavy and official. Silas transferred this property to an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary 3 years ago, I stated coldly. I kept my eyes locked on the developer as he leaned over the table. He was a seasoned professional in the real estate sector. He did not need a lawyer to translate the document resting in front of him. He recognized the authentic municipal seal, the notarized signatures of the trust attorneys, and the precise legal language granting me sole ownership. The realization washed over him, turning his flushed face a pale ashen gray. He understood instantly that the men he had been negotiating with possessed zero legal authority to sell the land beneath his feet. I did not stop there. A firewall does not just block an intrusion. It isolates the threat and records the exact methodology of the attack. I reached back into the leather bag and pulled out the thick stack of supplemental evidence I had printed in Portland. I laid down the property tax receipts first. For 36 months I had paid the municipal assessments, the winterization costs, and the utility maintenance fees out of my own checking account. I fanned the receipts across the table to prove an unbroken chain of financial stewardship. Then I produced the technical data. I set down the printed IP logs, tracing the forged document directly to Mason's personal laptop. I provided the digital overlay demonstrating how Silas's signature was copied pixel for pixel from an old tax return. Furthermore, I continued, my voice slicing through the biting winter wind. I have documented proof of forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy, and notary tampering. The seal on your closing documents belongs to a compromised official in Portland. The developer flinched at the phrase notary tampering. In the realm of commercial real estate, a forged notary seal elevates a transaction from a simple civil dispute to a severe federal crime. He knew that wiring $1 million based on a counterfeit state seal would subject his entire Boston holding company to a devastating federal investigation. His company would be audited, his professional licenses would be revoked, and his investors would vanish. He had walked onto my porch expecting to sign a lucrative deal, and instead he found himself standing at ground zero of a racketeering conspiracy, having neutralized my family. I pivoted my focus entirely to the buyer. He had assumed he could swoop into the northern woods, exploit a local family, and bulldoze a piece of heritage without consequence. He needed to understand the precise depth of his own exposure. I reached into the leather bag one final time. I extracted the manila envelope containing the downloaded municipal filings. I pulled out the computer-aided architectural blueprints and spread them across the cedar table, covering the forged deed entirely. The detailed renderings of his proposed glass and steel structure stared back at him. "And I have your unapproved demolition blueprints," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "These plans represent a blatant violation of Maine shoreline zoning laws. You intended to exploit a non-conforming structure loophole to clear-cut old-growth pines and pour concrete within 100 feet of the high water mark." The architect standing near the railing suddenly looked terrified. He clutched his rolled documents tighter to his chest, realizing their covert environmental circumvention was now a matter of documented record. "I suggest you leave my property before I have you trespassed," I told the developer. The executive did not hesitate. The cost-benefit analysis of the situation required no further calculation. The deal was toxic. The sellers were criminals. The caretaker was a security analyst holding a comprehensive dossier of his illicit zoning plans. He snatched his silver fountain pen off the table and shoved it into his tailored coat pocket. He grabbed the architect by the elbow, pulling him roughly toward the porch stairs. Before descending the steps, the developer turned back. He did not look at me. He locked his furious gaze onto my mother. Susan stood frozen by the front door, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "You will be hearing from my legal team for the broker fees and my wasted time." He spat, his voice laced with pure venom. He did not wait for her response. He marched down the wooden steps, the architect rushing to keep pace. They practically sprinted across the frosted grass toward the sleek black Range Rover parked in the driveway. The heavy doors slammed shut, the sound echoing sharply across the frozen cove. The powerful engine roared to life, tires spinning and kicking up thick clouds of icy gravel as the vehicle reversed rapidly out of the yard. The Range Rover sped down the narrow logging road, disappearing into the dense tree line. I stood on the porch and listened to the engine noise fade into the distance until the deep silence of the Maine woods returned. The fraudulent sale was dead. The paperwork guillotine had dropped, severing their intricate web of lies with cold, irrefutable data. The buyers were gone, the millions of dollars had vanished into the winter air, and my family was left standing on the porch, trapped on my land with nowhere left to hide from the consequences of their actions. The dust kicked up by the developer's departing vehicle settled slowly over the frozen yard. As the roar of the luxury engine faded down the logging road, a profound and heavy silence reclaimed the wraparound porch. Without the Boston executives present to serve as an audience, the elaborate performance my family had been staging for weeks dissolved into the frigid Maine air. Susan, Mason, and Harper stood frozen among the rustic cedar furniture, resembling actors stranded on a stage after the theater had lost power. The million-dollar lifeline they had so meticulously engineered was gone, replaced by the crushing, undeniable weight of their own documented felonies. I remained standing at the head of the wooden table, my hand resting gently on the red cardboard folder containing the authentic deed. I did not move to offer comfort. I did not attempt to build a bridge for reconciliation. I simply let the silence stretch, forcing them to inhabit the desolate wreckage of their own making. Harper broke the quiet first. The grim reality of her predatory creditors, the merchants currently hovering over her boutique inventory in Portland, crashed down upon her shoulders. She reverted instinctively to the only survival tactic she had ever successfully employed. She began to cry. Throughout our childhood, her tears had functioned as a highly calibrated mechanism deployed whenever she overspent her credit limit or needed someone else to absorb the consequences of her actions. But these tears were different. They were raw, choked, and born of genuine terror. She took a step toward me, her hands clasped together in a frantic, trembling plea. She begged me to reconsider, insisting that her entire livelihood was about to evaporate into thin air. She sobbed that they were going to lose everything, crying out that they had always planned to give me a cut of the sale proceeds. It was a pathetic, transparent lie. The metadata on their wire transfer instructions clearly indicated a routing number leading directly to a joint checking account, bearing only her name and our mother's name. There was never a designated percentage for the scapegoat. I looked at my younger sister, watching her chest heave with panic, and felt an overwhelming sense of detachment. She was mourning a retail lifestyle funded by deceit, weeping over the loss of a financial rescue. She believed she was owed simply for existing. Seeing Harper unravel so quickly, Susan stepped forward desperately, attempting to regain control of the fractured narrative. She bypassed anger and went straight for her ultimate, most historically effective weapon: maternal guilt. For a quarter of a century, Susan had maintained order in our household by weaponizing her disappointment. She possessed an uncanny ability to twist any scenario until she emerged as the tragic victim, painting me as the ungrateful child, failing to meet basic familial obligations. She reached out her fingers, shaking in the biting cold, and tried to grasp my forearm. I took a deliberate step backwards, severing the physical connection before she could make contact. Her face crumpled into a mask of profound sorrow. She pleaded with me, her voice wavering, telling me that I could not do this to them. She invoked the sacred bond of blood, insisting that we were a family and that they were just trying to survive an impossible financial crisis. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the freezing air, visible like the vapor of our breath. I looked at the woman who had intentionally orchestrated my isolation. She had instructed Mason to give me the address of a rundown strip mall diner. She had planned to let me sit alone in a vinyl booth eating a solitary meal on a holiday of gratitude, all while she forged my grandfather's signature to steal my inheritance. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the measured, steady cadence of a judge reading a final verdict. I quoted her own foundational doctrine back to her. "Family takes care of family, Mom," I said, letting the syllables hang between us. I watched her eyes widen as she recognized the exact phrase she had used to extort my paycheck just 24 hours prior. "You took care of yourselves. Now you can take care of the developer's legal fees. You can take care of Harper's predatory loans. And you can take care of the fraud investigation I am currently forwarding to the State Attorney General." The mention of the State Attorney General landed like a physical blow to the chest. The abstract concept of a failed real estate deal suddenly hardened into the terrifying concrete reality of criminal prosecution. Mason, who had been leaning heavily against the porch railing, turned a sickly pale shade of gray. The false bravado he wore like a tailored suit unraveled entirely. He was a man who spent his life dodging minor consequences, charming his way out of parking tickets and leveraging country club connections to avoid paying his debts. He lacked the psychological fortitude to process the impending reality of federal charges. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden primal fear. The realization that his signature was on the forged quitclaim deed alongside the stamp of a corrupt notary he had procured finally penetrated his arrogance. He stammered, his voice cracking under the immense strain. He told me that I would not send my own brother to jail. I maintained my zero-trust composure. I looked at my older brother, evaluating the forged documents resting on the cedar table separating us. In information security, you learn that every action leaves a digital trace, and every trace carries a tangible consequence. Mason had chosen to locate a compromised official. Mason had chosen to copy Silas's signature from a tax return. Mason had chosen to construct the framework of their destruction. "I did not forge the signature, Mason," I stated, my tone devoid of any residual sympathy. "You built the cage. I am just locking the door." The finality of the statement effectively extinguished any remaining hope they harbored. The debate was over. The negotiation was permanently closed. I looked at the three of them shivering on the porch of the cabin my grandfather built and issued my final directive. I ordered them off my property. I told them to collect their belongings, get in their vehicle, and drive back down the logging road. I warned them that if they ever set foot on Moosehead Lake again, I would have the county sheriff arrest them for trespassing. They did not argue. The fight had been drained from them, replaced by a hollow, staggering realization of their impending ruin. Susan turned away, her shoulders stooped, looking decades older than the polished matriarch who had arrived an hour ago. Harper wiped her face with the back of her designer sleeve, her sobs reducing to quiet, shallow hiccups. Mason stumbled toward the heavy front door of the cabin, disappearing inside to retrieve the meager supplies they had brought for their celebration. Hai emerged a moment later, his posture defeated. He carried the store-bought turkey in its thin plastic grocery bag, and tucked the 2 unopened bottles of champagne under his arm. The items looked absurd and pathetic, useless props from a play that had been cancelled mid-performance. They descended the wooden steps in total silence. The crunch of their boots on the frosted gravel sounded heavy and labored, a stark contrast to the eager energy they had displayed upon arrival. They loaded their items into the back of Susan's sport utility vehicle. No one spoke a single word. The doors slammed shut, enclosing them in a cold, silent tomb of their own design. The engine turned over, producing a sluggish rumble in the freezing air. I stood on the porch, my hands resting on the weathered leather satchel, and watched as the vehicle reversed slowly out of the yard. The financial and legal devastation they were driving back to meet was entirely self-inflicted, the direct result of their own greed colliding with an unyielding boundary. I stood on the frost-covered porch and watched the red taillights of Susan's vehicle fade down the winding logging road. The glow grew fainter as the sport utility vehicle navigated the dense stands of evergreen trees, eventually dipping below the ridge and vanishing from sight. The mechanical hum of the engine lingered in the frigid air for a few seconds before the natural acoustics of northern Maine reclaimed the landscape. The wind swept through the bare branches of the birch trees. The ice along the edge of Moosehead Lake shifted with a hollow, echoing crack. A profound, overwhelming quiet settled over the property. It was the exact type of quiet my grandfather Silas had loved. I waited for a rush of vindictive triumph to wash over me. I expected to feel a surge of boastful victory, the kind of boastful pride my brother Mason always chased. I felt none of those things. The sensation anchoring me to the wooden floorboards was much simpler. It was the distinct, clean feeling of a ledger, balancing to zero. The deficit they had spent a lifetime running against my boundaries was officially closed. I did not win a war today. I simply stopped participating in their relentless campaign of extraction. I turned away from the driveway and walked inside the cabin. I grasped the heavy iron handle of the front door and pulled it shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp metallic finality that resonated in my chest. The temperature inside the main living space had dropped during the confrontation on the porch, holding a persistent, biting chill. I moved toward the heavy fieldstone hearth that dominated the center of the room. Silas had built this chimney by hand, carefully selecting river rocks that could withstand a century of intense heat. I knelt on the stone hearth, gathering a handful of dried birch bark and split cedar kindling. I struck a match, watching the small yellow flame catch the edge of the bark. The fire crackled to life, the dry wood popping and hissing as the heat expanded. I added thicker logs of seasoned oak, building a steady, enduring blaze. The rich scent of wood smoke began to fill the room. It smelled like heritage. It smelled like survival. The warmth radiated outward, chasing the residual cold from the corners of the cabin, thawing the tension that had settled deep into my muscles over the past 72 hours. I unbuttoned Silas's heavy wool coat and draped it over the back of a rocking chair. The digital world of threat actors, forged metadata, and wire fraud felt distant now, replaced by the analog reality of a wood fire and solid timber walls. My solitude did not last, nor did I want it to. A little over an hour later, the distinct crunch of tires on gravel announced a second arrival. This time, I did not need to monitor a security feed or prepare a defensive strategy. I walked to the window and watched a beat-up Subaru pull into the yard. The doors opened and 2 of my closest colleagues from the cybersecurity firm stepped out into the winter air. Ben and Rachel were the only people who knew the full extent of the operation I had executed today. They did not ask probing questions or demand emotional performances. They simply showed up carrying grocery bags and a bottle of wine. The back door of their vehicle popped open, and a blur of gold bounded onto the frozen grass. My rescue dog, a golden retriever named Cypher, had spent the past 3 days at Rachel's apartment while I secured the property. Cypher spotted me through the glass and immediately sprinted up the wooden steps, his tail wagging with frantic, unburdened joy. I opened the door, and he pushed his way inside, bringing a rush of cold air and pure, uncomplicated affection into the room. He circled the cedar table, sniffing the floorboards where the Boston developer had stood hours earlier, erasing the lingering tension of the morning. That evening, I did not eat alone in a depressing diner. I did not sit in a vinyl booth waiting for people who viewed my presence as an inconvenience. I sat in my own home, surrounded by my chosen family. We prepared a simple meal together in the narrow, rustic kitchen. We roasted a chicken, the skin crisping perfectly in the heat of the oven, and cooked a medley of winter root vegetables. We pulled 3 mismatched wooden chairs around the same cedar table that had served as the staging ground for a fraudulent real estate closing just a few hours prior. The space was no longer contaminated by greed. It was filled with the sounds of plates clinking, wine pouring, and genuine laughter. Bun recounted a ridiculous story about a failed penetration test at work, and Rachel fed Cypher small pieces of roasted carrot under the table when she thought I was not looking. We ate until we were full, letting the warmth of the fire and the comfort of good company insulate us against the harsh Maine winter raging outside the windows. The contrast between the family I was born into and the family I had built could not have been more striking. One required constant payments to maintain a fragile peace, while the other demanded nothing more than my authentic presence. The fallout from that Thanksgiving morning took nearly a year to fully resolve. I did not follow their demise with eager anticipation, but the legal and financial ripples were impossible to ignore. I forwarded the entire dossier of digital evidence to the state attorney general, fulfilling the promise I made on the porch. The ensuing investigation triggered a brutal sequence of consequences for my relatives. Mason narrowly avoided a prison sentence by agreeing to a comprehensive plea deal, but the state permanently revoked his real estate broker license. His reputation in the Portland business community was shredded, leaving him unemployable in the financial sector. Harper could no longer outrun her predatory creditors. Without the $1 million cash infusion she had banked on the merchant cash advance companies, seized her boutique inventory and drained her accounts. She filed for personal and commercial bankruptcy just after the new year, her curated designer lifestyle evaporating overnight. Susan suffered the most severe blow. The Boston developer followed through on his threat. He filed a devastating civil lawsuit against her for breach of contract fraud and the recovery of his legal and appraisal fees. The litigation drained her savings. She was ultimately forced to sell her pristine, immaculate suburban home to cover the settlement and her own mounting legal bills. None of them ever returned to Moosehead Lake. They never called to apologize, and I never reached out to demand closure. Some bridges do not need to be repaired. They just need to be allowed to rot and fall into the river. I spent the remainder of that Thanksgiving weekend sitting in the rocking chair by the large picture window, a heavy ceramic mug of dark roast coffee resting in my hands. The gray sky finally gave way to the impending winter storm. I watched the first heavy flakes of snow drift down through the ancient pine branches, landing softly on the dark, freezing water of the lake. The snow covered the tire tracks in the driveway, erasing the last physical evidence that my family had ever been there. Cypher slept soundly on a braided rug near the hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow across his golden fur. The perimeter was secure. The threat had been neutralized using their own predictable behaviors against them. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the crisp, clean air fill my lungs. My grandfather Silas's legacy was safe from the bulldozers and the developers. My personal boundaries were impenetrable, reinforced by the cold, unforgiving reality of property law and data forensics. For the first time in my 26 years, the cabin was finally entirely and peacefully mine.
We often think of inheritance in terms of notarized deeds, offshore bank accounts, and physical heirlooms passed down through generations. In the American landscape, where the relentless pursuit of success frequently equates to the accumulation of material wealth, the true legacy we leave our children is easily obscured by the noise of consumerism. The story of Willa Gerson and the cabin on Moosehead Lake is far more than a tale of property rights and digital forensics. It is a striking mirror held up to modern parenting, reflecting the quiet daily choices that build a human soul or dismantle it. When we strip away the cold data of cybersecurity and the rigid boundaries of property law, what remains is a profound study of family dynamics. It forces us to ask a difficult question. Are we raising our children to be resilient, or are we paving their roads so smoothly that they forget how to walk? Consider Susan, a mother who confused affection with endless rescue. In a culture that highly values individual achievement and external validation, it is remarkably easy for parents to fall into the trap of enabling. Susan used her resources to shield Harper and Mason from the consequences of their own choices. When a child stumbles, the primal instinct is to catch them before they hit the ground. Yet affection lacking in wisdom often becomes a quiet poison. By continuously intervening, Susan robbed her favored children of the fundamental right to fail. She erased the friction they needed to grow. Wisdom in parenting requires the agonizing discipline of letting go. Loving a child does not mean clearing every stone and briar from their path. It means providing them with a sturdy pair of boots and teaching them how to navigate the rough terrain. When we bail our children out of every financial mistake or social misstep, we do not create strong adults. We cultivate fragile, arrogant individuals who eventually collapse under the weight of reality. A parent must recognize that allowing a child to fall is often the most profound act of love, for it is in the getting up that they discover their own strength. This brings us to the facade of success. Modern society frequently measures a person by their outward markers: the luxury car in the driveway, the designer boutique, the inflated job title. Harper and Mason chased these empty identifiers, driven by a matriarch who valued the appearance of prosperity over actual integrity. To maintain this hollow image, the family was willing to trade their moral center. They plotted to steal, to forge, and to deceive their own flesh and blood, prioritizing a sterile glass house over the hand-hewn timber of their heritage. The lesson here transcends real estate. Children are astute observers. They absorb what we do long before they understand what we say. Morality is not a glossy veneer applied for holiday dinners or social media posts. True integrity is what happens in the dark when the security cameras are turned off and the checkbook is balanced. If we want to raise children who understand honesty and fairness, we must first confront our own greed. We must model the quiet dignity of honest labor. The Gerson family traded their ethical foundation for a quick wire transfer, and in doing so, they reaped a devastating collapse of both their finances and their dignity. The law of cause and effect remains unforgiving, ignoring the superficial titles we bestow upon ourselves. Against this backdrop of chaos, Willa stands as a testament to inner resilience and the raw power of emotional awareness. Faced with an ultimate betrayal, she did not resort to screaming vengeance or volatile retaliation. Instead, she anchored herself in silence. She observed, she documented, and she established an impenetrable boundary. In a world that equates volume with power, Willa demonstrated that true strength often resides in stillness. She refused to act the victim, utilizing her composure to sever the ties to a toxic dynamic. For parents, fostering this kind of resilience is paramount. It takes immense willpower to look a child in the eye and say no to an unreasonable demand. Saying no is uncomfortable. It invites conflict, defiance, and tears. Yet yielding to every whim requires zero courage, while holding a firm boundary demands incredible inner fortitude. We must teach our children to stand resolute against the endless tide of material temptation. We must guide them to find peace internally, much like Willa, sitting by a quiet hearth in a snowy cabin, rather than constantly seeking external validation. By setting healthy boundaries, we teach them how to protect their own peace when they eventually face a world that will demand their compliance. In modern culture, the pressure to provide a flawless life for our children is pervasive. The media we consume constantly broadcasts a narrative equating a child's struggle with a parent's failure. This illusion pushes well-meaning families into a cycle of overprotection. We buy the expensive car to shield them from inconvenience. We pull strings to erase their professional blunders. However, true family responsibility is not about buffering children from the natural consequences of their actions. It is about standing beside them as they face those consequences, offering guidance rather than a rescue boat. A child who has never weathered a storm will not know how to sail when the sky darkens. The home is the first and most critical training ground. It is the sanctuary where the blueprints of a child's character are drawn. Before we can guide them, we must scrutinize our own reflections, reining in our egos and checking our own desires for status. The most valuable inheritance we can transfer is not a lakefront property or a funded trust account. It is the wisdom to discern right from wrong, the morality to walk a righteous path, and the resilience to stand independently. These are the stories that shape us, the quiet dramas playing out behind closed doors that ultimately define who we become. If you found a piece of your own journey reflected in Willa's quiet strength, or if you are navigating the complex waters of setting boundaries within your own home, join our community. Drop a comment below, share your experiences, and hit subscribe to follow Fluffy Revenge for more narratives where the quiet ones finally find their voice. As the winter snow covers the tire tracks on a lonely main road, erasing the physical evidence of a family's fracture, we are left to ponder the spaces we inhabit and the legacies we leave behind. We spend our lives building houses, insulating walls, and securing perimeters against the bitter cold. We work tirelessly to acquire assets, assuming that wealth equates to safety. But when the night falls, the screens go dark, and the fire dims, we must eventually ask ourselves, are we building a sanctuary that will nurture our children into capable adults? Or are we simply constructing a beautiful, fragile cage, waiting for the first strong wind to tear it apart?